Professor Layton and Pandora's Box is my absolute favourite video game of all time. It's quirky, charming, and has fantastic locations that I'd never seen anything like before, especially in a video game. Where Curious Village only had one place to explore, Pandora's Box had 3 separate and unique locations for the player to discover, 4 if you include the train itself. But Folsense had the most remarkable atmosphere of all the locations in any Layton game, and I will stand by that. The towers fading off into the sky, the breaking illusion of the East End, the gorgeous lights on every building. No other location came close to matching that sense of atmosphere. See, my hometown really isn't that special. There's nothing to do, it's super expensive, and the biggest attraction is probably the garden centre. But the one redeeming feature of growing up in the least exciting place in England was the railway line that ran straight through the middle of it. Every time the school holidays would roll around, I'd grab my camera and hop on a train with my granddad, as we headed out into the capital to see the sights and attractions. And very soon, travelling by rail became my favourite mode of transport. Rushing through the countryside, past all the little towns and villages, wondering what kind of people or places lay within. So getting able to do so with my favourite video game characters was unreal to me. Where I'd been travelling away from the towns and villages, in an effort to try and find bigger and more exciting things, Layton and Luke were travelling back to the kind of place that I was from. And while Dropstone and Folsense are obviously completely fictional, it made me wonder where they could be if they were to exist in the real world. Some places in the games, especially in Layton's London, are based on real-world places. So maybe, just maybe, we could find Folsense too. I started by looking at the station we see at the very beginning of the game as Layton and Luke get ready to board the Monetary Express and start their adventure. While exploration of this area isn't actually allowed and is only ever seen in a cutscene, we can still pick out some key details that can start the investigation. For the benefit of this video, I'm also going to be assuming the game takes place during the 1960s, as this is the time period the developers confirmed they based the games on. To start, we can look at the back wall of the station and see that this station is a terminus, meaning it's the end of the line. This instantly narrowed it down to the amount of stations this could be. Many of these stations have since closed, though in Layton's time period they'd still be functioning. Knowing that when the train departs the station, it drives off into a part of the city, we can eliminate Charing Cross and Cannon Street, as these lines all exit onto a bridge across the Thames. Bishopsgate can be eliminated here too, as this station only served as a goods station by the time Layton and Luke take their journey, so they wouldn't have boarded here, and City Thameslink didn't technically exist yet, so this can be eliminated as well. But I still needed to narrow it down further, as there were still 13 places left to investigate. My next move was to look at the ceilings in the concourse. The classic design seen in the Layton station roof is one that's used in many London stations. The extra space would always be needed for steam and smoke to dissipate, and the cost for soundproofing for buildings above was always going to be far too high to consider. As large buildings and an even larger city, railway companies wanted their stations to stand out, and giant glass roofs were a great way of doing so. Researching this, I found that Euston, Marylebone, Holborn Viaduct and Broad Street had similar roofs, but were more triangular in design. Similarly, Waterloo could be close, so this design was too square. Fenchurch Street had a similar-ish roof, though there were too many other elements in the concourse for it to be considered the right station, such as this square arch in the middle. And then there's Liverpool Street, which is an incredibly complicated roof, eliminating that one. I mean, look at that. Who designed that and then built it? Honestly.
What? That's absurd.
Paddington, Victoria and London Bridge had similar concourses, but these were too large with too many platforms. And Moorgate didn't even have a concourse at all, but was just an open-air station which eliminated that. That just left us King's Cross and St Pancras, which had almost identical concourses to the one in Layton's London. The final piece of the puzzle came in identifying a small design in the background of this shot of the station, the clock. One of the more famous aspects of St Pancras Station is its station clock. This one once holding the record for the largest clock in any English railway station. It was replaced by a digital clock in the late 1960s, though assuming the events of the game take place in the early 60s, we can assume that this is the original. And that was that. Now we can start looking at where St Pancras led to and where Folsense could really lie. Except I was completely wrong.
Oh, how embarrassing.
In 2009, Level 5 released a book called Professor Layton's Secret Book, which was a compilation of artwork, interviews and behind-the-scenes content from the first Layton trilogy. Just like the elusive Elysian box, this item came into my possession quite surprisingly, after I found it going quite cheap on eBay. The book was only ever released in Japanese, so I had to do a little bit of translating myself to try and find out the right information. Which wasn't always great,
It's the wind in the willows, the wind in the willows, the wind in the willows, the wind.
However, if we turn to page 68 of this book, we can see some of the research Level 5 did into British railways and stations. And right down here at the bottom is an image of the station they use for inspiration. A quick reverse search of this image gets us this stock photo of Paddington, which coincidentally is home to the Great Western Railway, whose livery looks somewhat similar to our very own cruise ship on rails. So now we know it's Paddington, let's take a look at some of the routes it could have taken. To develop from this, we had to understand the layout of Folsense, so that we could line that up with the existing towns in the UK. Using cutscene 20 from Pandora's box, we can see that the sun is rising over Folsense's train station, which makes Folsense's actual layout look a little bit like this, putting the station in the east and the castle in the west. This gave us a little bit more to work with, though our Folsense also had to have a notable museum, a history in mining or excavation, and a large forest or wood nearby. I also eliminated the possibility that Leighton Luke travelled across the country border into Wales, as the accents of the people in Dropstone and Folsense were very clearly English. And so I started combing through all the different terminus stations from Paddington to see what we could find. The two closest towns I could find using just this search criteria were Penzance and Redhill. The Penzance's coastal location and Redhill's lack of a museum and mining history, coupled with the fact it's home to multiple stations, meant it couldn't be either of these towns. And so the search ground to a bit of a halt. It then struck me that Paddington to Folsense was not actually a direct route, as the train changed lines before reaching Luxembourg, creating this fantastic sliding puzzle in the middle of the countryside. This meant the line didn't actually have to be a GWR line, and could potentially be a historical heritage railway, which has since been privatised and doesn't connect to the national network, or been completely ripped up and built upon. But instead of then looking at every single station in the west of England to see if it met the criteria, I decided to change how I was searching for towns, ditching stations for castles, as there are a lot less castles in the west than there are stations. And so I hit up the Google Maps search bar for every castle I could find in the west of England. 69 of them. After several hours of ploughing through every castle I could find and figuring out how Google Sheets worked, I managed to narrow it down to 6 potential locations. And they are Watchet, Cheddar, High Wycombe, Farleigh Hungerford, Hopton Heath, and Oakhampton, which all sound like they could be places in a Leighton game already, to be honest. These all met the criteria that the castle was to the west of the station, the town had a notable museum, and there was a forest or woodland area nearby. Though we still had to narrow it down even further than that. First up was Watchet, a small town on the West Somerset railway line from Bishop's Litter to Minehead. The coastal location of this town meant it was the first to go, as it was clear Folsense is not on the coast. High Wycombe, on the other hand, was far too metropolitan, being too close to London. Hopton Heath and Farleigh Hungerford went, as the castles were too far from the stations, with Farleigh Hungerford having mostly farmland between the station and the castle. And so we were left with the final two, Cheddar and Oakhampton. Cheddar is a small town in Somerset, known mainly for Cheddar Gorge and caves, and being the birthplace of the world-famous cheddar cheese. The railway line to Cheddar doesn't actually exist anymore, having since been turned into a cycle path. The station building still remains as a private home. Cheddar Palace lies to east of where the station once was, though it isn't as grand as the name initially lets on, being a ruin of a bishop's palace now merged into the grounds of a local school, which didn't really compare very well when we looked at Oakhampton. Oakhampton's castle is much larger than Cheddar Palace, being the largest ruined castle in all of Devon, and similar to Folsense, it's separated from the town by a decent-sized woodland. The station in the east is also a terminus station, which only operates as part of a heritage line, the Dartmoor Railway, though it can be reached by the Great Western Railway on summer Sundays. The town is complete with several hotels and bars, a notable museum on the town and surrounding area's history, as well as a river running through it, much like in Folsense's East End. It might not be the crumbling remains of a town absorbed by wealth and hallucinogenic gas, but it's still the closest thing that exists to this little fantasy town. And with Folsense back on the map, we can see that it's very true that every puzzle has an answer.